Accountability looks different for different people, but that doesn't take away from the fact that some things are just inherently wrong, and people need to be held accountable for their actions. Domestic abuse is on top of the list of things that should not be tolerated under any circumstances whatsoever. However, the UFC's response to it has always been mixed. Let's see what's been going on in the wake of the recent Dana White domestic violence scandal. Starting off, why is Dana White being accused of domestic violence? The charismatic president of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, the strategic leader who established the MMA sport as one of the most popular in the world ever since he joined, the business mastermind, the king of the UFC world, Dana White now has another title attached to his name. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, he's now officially also known as a wife beater. Hey, don't be surprised. It's not like this man was fully unproblematic. Time and time again, Mr. White has been caught in controversies. So many of his female athletes have complained of having experienced misogyny. Remember when he held the belief that the UFC wasn't for women? And sexism wasn't the only issue he had. It was one of his many issues. The UFC president has been accused of mistreating his employees, underpaying them, abusing them, and yes, this applies to males and females both, so at least we can't accuse him of discrimination there. Oh, and remember the times he continued to hold public events even at the height of the COVID pandemic? It's safe to say that Mr. White has never been the perfect role model, but even then, his latest controversy came as a surprise to many of us. No one could have imagined that he'd go as far as to publicly slap his wife, but he did, and ever since then, the sports industry has been a little shaken, but the UFC has given us a very lukewarm response. But before we get into that, we need more context. Let's look at what happened between the two. Well, if you've been married for over 30 years and have known each other since the ripe young age of just 12 years old, there are bound to be ups and downs in a relationship. The road can get a tad bit rocky sometimes, but there's absolutely no justification that any issues between partners should result in either party exhibiting violence towards the other. But that's what it boiled down to when Dana White apparently slapped his wife right across the face on New Year's Eve. Apparently, Dana and Ann were both partying it out in Mexico, and things took an ugly turn between the pair. As it turns out, the Whites are probably dealing with some interpersonal issues in their relationship, and while these issues have been kept away from the public eye, their aftermath has been, well, quite the public affair. So now you're wondering what really happened between the two. Well, while we don't know what instigated it, from what we've seen in the grainy 49-second-long video leaked by TMZ, Ann seemed to have slapped Dana first, and he decided to retaliate by slapping back. Yikes. While we're not justifying her actions at all, two wrongs don't make a right. A wise man once said that an eye for an eye would make the entire world blind, and it seems to us that in a moment of rage, Dana really lost sight of the bigger picture too. Next up, the UFC's mixed response to domestic abuse so far. This incident has sparked a public debate about what's to happen next, and now that we have more context about the problem itself, we can perhaps speculate what the future holds. But sometimes, in order for us to better understand the future, we need to take a step back into the past. So in the next section of this video, we will explore some of the past instances in which the industry had to deal with cases of violence, starting with perhaps the most controversial of them all, Mr. Cody East, who was signed in 2016 despite his lengthy criminal history, which included a 3-year prison sentence for child abuse and battery and a no-contest plea on a third-degree charge of aggravated battery with a deadly weapon. Yikes, that is one long criminal record. But naturally, the UFC defended the decision by saying that they had an independent investigation conducted into his past and current behavior. And of course, Mr. East was taking intensive therapy. He was seeing a counselor, and even his probation officer said that the UFC might be a good place for him. Naturally, all of this seemed reason enough for the league to allow him to compete, but was that the best decision to make? Well, given that Cody was arrested again in 2022 for the same reasons, we'll leave the judgment up to you guys. Coming up, the curious case of Anthony Johnson. Mr. Rumble has created quite a rumbling effect in the world of UFC. This man has been accused of domestic violence not once or twice, but several times. In 3 separate instances, the man was charged with physical violence and assault. It started in 2009 when he was arrested for assault against his ex-girlfriend. The man was put on probation, and you'd expect that he learned his lesson, but some people really don't change. He was again charged with violence in 2012, and the UFC finally decided to take action against him by suspending him when the case was finally filed in court in 2014. But then the woman in question redacted the case, and Johnson was reinstated without any consequences. If that's not all, White even tried to discredit the victim and paint her as an unreliable liar of sorts. Isn't that a big red flag? And if this wasn't enough, the same guy had a run-in with another woman in a gym in 2015 where he verbally berated her and then again assaulted another one of his partners in 2019. During all these instances, the UFC's response was flaky at best. They condemned his actions in public, but never did anything to publicly remove him or set an example. Perhaps that's why things have gotten as bad as they have now. The problem lies in the lack of a strong stance. Let's look at how the pattern continued. Now, if we get into the gory details of every single instance in which the UFC failed to take a strong stance against violence and assault, we'd be here all night. What we can, however, do is notice the pattern that the industry itself, and and its president have always adopted when it comes to such cases. Be it Johnson or Jones or Pena or Silva or even White himself, these men always seem to be deserving of a second chance despite their mistakes. Yes, the UFC has often suspended players or condemned them publicly, but most of the time these fighters were brought back. Even when Jones publicly harassed a waitress, White's first line of defense was to look for explanations and excuses. The only circumstances in which any form of punishment has taken place is when the victims provided hard-hitting evidence, and we all know that's not always possible or viable. So from what we can tell, and based on past precedent, the UFC has always had a lukewarm response to violence. Based on this, we can only assume that the president of the industry might just get away with it. Moving on, the California Women's Caucus wants him removed. The couple quickly decided to ask for privacy to resolve their matters personally, but the thing about a public figure like White is that he's not only answerable to his wife, but also to the public. Someone in a position of authority like that has to face added scrutiny if they make mistakes this openly, and it's only fair. Otherwise, we're not really setting a good example for the younger generations. People could genuinely start thinking that you can behave like this and get away with it, and that's literally the reason why so many people want to hold White accountable. Besides other fighters of the UFC, we've also witnessed a number of political groups note the event. The California Legislative Women's Caucus, a political women's advocacy group, has called for the removal of Dana White as president of UFC in a public letter addressed to Endeavor CEO Ari Emanuel. This group comprises 18 state senators and 33 assemblywomen, and they all collectively announced that enough is enough. Now, we don't know whether or not their appeal would be heard given that White is a very strong man, but we don't blame them for feeling outraged. On one hand, White has been seen publicly making statements claiming that laying hands on a woman is absolutely unacceptable, but then he goes and does this. A tad hypocritical, no? Lastly, what does the future hold for Dana White? Female activist groups want him fired, but history is bound to repeat itself, and there's a chance that he might just walk away from this scratch-free. Well, not completely scratch-free, because of course his reputation has suffered quite a lot ever since the incident occurred, but from what it seems, that's the only form of accountability he's going to have to face. Now, we don't know how we feel about that, but White is of the view that removing himself from the industry for 30 or 60 days isn't going to hurt him as much as the industry itself. He recently spoke about the whole incident in an interview, and while he didn't have the decency to express his deep remorse, he also seemed to be in no mood for punishment. He claimed that his punishment was having to live with his crime and the knowledge that the world knows what he did. But is that enough, Mr. White? Many of his fighters seem to disagree. In fact, a lot of the fighters started taking digs at him for his stance. Akinta and Nehem went as far as to mock him publicly on Twitter by saying that by this logic, they shouldn't have been suspended for substance abuse or for hurling curses at the crowd either. Wasn't it enough that they had to live with their mistakes and the knowledge that the world was aware of them? Cheeky, we must say. We're still waiting to see White's response, but for now, it's a wrap. Let us know how you think the situation should be handled in the comments below. If you liked this video, don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.